So the new film Enola Holmes dropped on Netflix recently, and honestly, I'm all aboard for this awesome movie, and fingers crossed, a new franchise. Based on the book series by Nancy Springer, the film follows the events of the first book, where we're introduced to Enola Holmes, the younger sister of Mycroft and Sherlock Holmes, who begins her life in a new adventure once her mother disappears. So far, the film's been receiving really high praise, and it seems the internet's really invested in the potential for this new story, as are we. So today, I've decided to deep dive into the film and discuss our thoughts on the story and the possibility of a new future franchise. There were so many elements that made this film into an awesome experience. First off, the film had an amazing headline cast full of great actors, including Helena Bonham Carter, Henry Cavill, Sam Claflin, and of course, Millie Bobby Brown. 4 immensely talented actors to bring this story to life. And throughout the film, more talented actors were there to elevate the story even further. All the performances were incredibly convincing, particularly Sam Claflin, who plays a role so different to many others he's taken previously. It was really impossible not to hate the slimeball of a character, so kudos to him. The soundtrack was amazing. It was so unique and perfectly encapsulated the heart of the film. From Enola's theme to the end track of Enola and her mother, it elevated every scene, so well done to Daniel Pemberton. The screenwriting and directing was also top notch. The way the film flowed effortlessly and stood on its own 2 feet without being too similar to other Sherlock Holmes renditions is to be really commended. Also, I don't think it would be a stretch to say that the plot and the choices of character personalities and screen time seemed a better choice than in the original Enola source material. Maybe I'm being a bit harsh on the book, but the film adaptation sounds a whole lot better, and that really comes down to the choices made by the writing and the directing. The costumes as well were incredibly detailed. The vibrancy and the variation of the different looks for the characters definitely had a huge impact on the film in a really positive way. And last but not least, the messages. The film hones in so deeply on messages that were relevant 150 years ago and are still relevant today. It's obvious that there was so much care and love poured into the film to be the best it could be, and I think it was spectacular. Now, onto the review. The film follows the title character of Enola, and she immediately begins by directly addressing the audience, which is such a unique take on a film and can be incredibly risky. Breaking the fourth wall can seem really stupid if it's done poorly, but I believe it was executed beautifully. It added humour and immense insight into a character that was bound to have significant criticism, simply because she's a new female character who's become the primary focus based on the stories of her sibling Sherlock. We have a rather touching, almost Up-esque sequence following Enola's life with her mum, only to have all that ripped away with the abandonment of Enola and the introduction of her brothers, Sherlock and Mycroft. These 2 characters perfectly juxtapose one another, and it brings this fairy tale down to a deflating reality really quickly. Despite Sherlock being considerably kinder and understanding to Enola, he denies her the life she wishes to lead and proves that whilst his intentions are well-meaning, he isn't confident to contradict the social dynamic. However, this ends up being a positive, as it allows Enola to flourish and develop her character's detective skills to rival her own brothers. The cinematography, particularly during her detective state, is really reminiscent of other Sherlock depictions in recent film and TV, with quick cutaways and internal monologues, and is really enhanced by the almost child-esque upbeat soundtrack behind it. We then follow Enola and her plans to deceive her brothers to the train station, where the second half of the mystery begins. We meet Tewkesbury, and I, similar to Enola, had a healthy level of distaste for him in our first impression. Whilst he seemed pathetic at first glance, he did bring a lot of comedy right off the bat and helped diffuse our harsh judgment of him fairly quickly. They narrowly escape the very creepy bowler hat man and begin their journey as the new ship, Holmesbury. We discover that Tewkesbury has his own little quirks compared to normal society, particularly his progressive values and his love of plants, and he proves himself useful to Enola, sparking a budding relationship. After a prompt shutdown by Enola and a quick trim, the 2 misfits head straight for London. Shortly after their arrival, Enola sets off on her own, and we feel that sense of disappointment to not see them develop a little bit further, but curious as to what's going to happen next. I found it interesting to note that immediately Enola was aware that her mother had not prepared her for the outside world. Often within these stories, there's almost a sense of betrayal or anger when the main character finds out they're not adequately equipped for their role in society. But that didn't really seem to be the case with Enola. It was more of a matter-of-fact statement than anything else, which was a nice change. The scene where she changes into the red dress in a playful manner was pretty hilarious and lures you into believing that Enola has all of this taken care of and she's not going to be swindled anymore, only to be quickly sent back down to reality by being scammed into renting a rat-infested room. Finally, we begin the tracing of her mother using newspapers and visiting old friends. We're introduced to Edith, an old friend of Euphoria who looks out for Enola whilst remaining loyal to her mother's cause. Despite not receiving much information, Enola manages to track down where her mother could be and heads towards the back alleys of London. We discover a trail of dangerous explosives, and it's heavily hinted at the prospect of attacking primary figures who have a say in the suffragette movement. Immediately, you begin to believe that Euphoria, Edith, and many other women are behind a large-scale, impending attack if things don't go their way, and this leaves Enola with a lot of burning questions and deep in thought. And this is perfect timing really for the creepy bowler hat man to make another appearance and try and assassinate her. I love this whole sequence. The humour in the dialogue, the smarts of Enola to fake him out, and the fight scene itself, which was largely realistic in the sense that Enola's training and smarts were almost outmatched against a much larger and stronger opponent, and neither really got away without damaging the other. It's always frustrating when the main character is given so much power and leverage over others and takes the suspense and fear away of any real danger, so I'm glad that Enola Holmes is building a reputation to not really be that way. And then we reach a turning point in the film, where Enola reflects on her mother's advice and her own personality. This is key in the film, as we learn that despite Enola's name meaning alone, and despite the advice from her only other primary family member, she acts with her own heart and personality and becomes her own person. Enola decides that she wants to live up to her own expectations, not the ones others have for her, even people who love her. And I think this is a really good underlying message that the film sends. So, the direction changes from finding mother to saving Tewkesbury, and we're off to the Tewkesbury estate, dressed as a widow. And that ties into another humorous trait of Enola, in that she seemingly has a flair for dramatics and relishes in the idea of constantly changing how people perceive her. We're introduced to the Tewkesbury family and Lestrade, which leads to an awkwardly funny confrontation where Enola refuses to back down, causing everyone in the room to question everything that's going on. Lestrade leaves, confused but impressed, and Enola remains to further discover details about Tewkesbury, beginning the classic trope of paying someone to swap clothes with her. She discovers his hideout and becomes ever so slightly enamoured with the idea of Tewkesbury and his wits to lead others astray. I'm glad they explained how the assassin found her in London and didn't leave that sort of up in the air, because I was worried that they might and it didn't really make sense at first watch. Suddenly she's approached by the grandmother, and honestly, a little part of me is so frustrated that I didn't pick up on the grandmother being evil here, because now it seems so obvious, but never mind. We then go back to London with Enola, this time finding Tewkesbury in a pretty adorable scene. The colours and vibrancy in this scene is something I really liked, and is a great contrast between how Tewkesbury and Enola have been spending their time in London. Back in Enola's room, there's even more emphasis put on the fact that Enola hasn't quite got everything together, as even Tewkesbury has managed to find better accommodation than her. This, accompanied by him finding out that she's looking for her mother in a desperate kind of way, makes for a very real, awkward, but sweet scene. However, chaos quickly ensues and these two must once again be parted, to the incredible misfortune of Enola. Mycroft takes great delight in having caught his little sister, and both performances here from Millie and Sam are astounding and felt so real. It's devastating and it's raw, and I really liked it. We then begin to see the crumbling of Enola's spirit and see doubt start to seep in all that she believed in at Miss Harrison's finishing school. Sherlock then appears almost like a fairy godmother to the hopeless heroine to give her that final nudge of encouragement to not give up. And then to top it all off, Enola's previously useless companion becomes her daring saviour, returning the favour to rescue her. I think this was the scene where it hit me as to how superbly they'd built up this budding romance. There was so much growth on this front throughout the film, but it was almost undetectable in a way because of how much effort they put into focusing on Enola as a solo character. The flower market was cute and all, but this is where I boarded the Holmesbury train. Leaving the school was a super fun scene to watch, and Enola heeding Sherlock's advice was a great build up to the final showdown. And speaking of the final showdown, what an intense scene that turned out to be. I was honestly on the edge of my seat the whole time, not sure what was going to happen. And can we take a moment to talk about the awful noise where the creepy bowler hat guy hits his head? Yikes. And then we have good old Granny to come out of nowhere to shoot her grandson. What a nice woman. Then we had a lovely Tewkesbury and Enola moment, and the sudden realisation by the grandmother that she's totally screwed, which was pretty amusing. And then this leads into a really long conclusion. Now, I've had lots to gush about with this film, but if there's one thing I'd nitpick, it's the ending. Now, that's not to say I don't love all the scenes that follow, but every time a scene happens past the showdown, I'm waiting for the credits and they just don't come. They probably could have saved some scenes for a future sequel, but I understand that they weren't really sure at the time if they'd get one, so you win some, you lose some. Sherlock was gold in his realisation that his sister could match his intellect and maybe even surpass him in time. My heart definitely melted with the Enola and Tewkesbury farewell. They ended it perfectly, leaving the audience wanting more but giving the perfect amount to leave you satisfied. The ending with the Holmes brothers was good, teasing that Enola will become Sherlock's ward and showing the growth they've had throughout the film and how Enola changed him for the better. And finally, the moment where Enola and her mother meet again was a really tender scene, and I loved it. The music and emotions within were so beautiful and such great performances. When I initially saw it, I didn't think the film really needed it, as I expected it to be followed up in a new film, but it was a perfect way to end it, and definitely didn't feel out of place. So that being said, will there be a sequel? Chances are, I would say yes. Once the lawsuit's over and hopefully all goes well, Netflix is hopefully going to partner with either the same or another studio to bring this strong story along for another 5 films. I, for one, definitely want to see all these characters again on screen together, and would be thrilled at the idea of adapting all 6 Enola Holmes books with varying levels of faithfulness. I know Tewkesbury is only within the first book, but honestly, everybody would probably riot, myself included, if he wasn't part of Enola's journey going forward. Enola even says that he's not rid of her yet, so I dare say we're going to see him again. There's definitely a lot you could do with his character that could help develop Enola as a result. I think I'd also like to explore Enola and Sherlock's relationship and how Mycroft plays into all that. And maybe even to delve more into Euphoria. There's lots more of her story to tell too, so I'd love to see that. This film perfectly encapsulates a wonderful story with relevant messages, and I really can't wait to see the story continue. But what about you? Did you love it like me, or maybe not? What are your hopes for the story? Let me know.